Or dire situations, the governor of Osun State painting there. Well, we're joined now by Mr. Kwame Agbaje, a policy analyst, to look at this matter. Thank you for coming on this
Thank you very much.
Well, this kind of scenario that we find ourselves in, 18 states at the moment grappling with paying salaries, and one wonders, didn't they see this coming, or what?
Well, it's embarrassing. You've asked the right question. I think there's not the pretending as if there's some mysterious decline in income, something that was totally inexplicable and just out of the blues. That's the part I find curious. We had a global recession in 2008, which resulted in very sharp declines in oil prices. That's not ancient memory. The only reason we got through that was because we had foreign reserves of 45 billion and excess crude of another 20 billion. So we had around 65 billion in savings, which the Yar'Adua regime drew heavily on. That's not ancient memory. It's not distant memory. The whole world has been talking about oil prices. Everybody knows that Nigeria depends, the federal, the states are all dependent. So this was not inexplicable, it was not unexpected, there was nothing mysterious about it. For me, it's just a failure of management, a failure of policy, a very poor economic management. It even raises questions, quite frankly, as to whether we have the right people in the public sector in charge of the public finances at the levels of the budget and planning finance ministries, and in some cases possibly even in the governorship office. It's basically a failure of management. Could you imagine a CEO of a bank lamenting his inability to pay salaries? So if he does do that, he will call to question his suitability for that office.
Whatever happened to that phrase, save for the rainy days, is what we want to go back and look at when you talked about the fund, the excess crude account. And there was also the sovereign wealth fund. And I recall then most states were they argued against it, saying that, look, we want it distributed as well. Aren't there indications, that will point to a direction that something like this was imminent?
That's precisely why, part of why it's a failure of leadership and management. So Nigeria knew that for 3.5 decades, 3 decades, since 1970, when we became an oil-producing big-time nation, we argued, people in the policy space argued over and over again that we needed a sovereign wealth fund. We eventually got one established in 2011, which was the last bill the president signed in the term in which he was completing Yar'Adua's regime. So we got a sovereign wealth fund. But these same governors went to court to stop its operation. We put $1 billion in there. And they're in court, and the case is in the Supreme Court. They prevented further disbursements to the sovereign wealth fund. The same governors insisted every time on a sharing of the excess good accounts. Now, on the part of the National Assembly, because we should share the responsibility and the failures appropriately, on the part of the National Assembly, every time for the last 6 years, indeed for the last 16 years, the battle started under Obasanjo. Obasanjo was just more strong-willed, if you want to use a polite word. The Federal Minister of Finance always sent a budget price benchmark, a slightly conservative budget price benchmark, which will allow you accrue some savings into the excess crude account, and today, if it's allowed to
if the business is still good,
yes,
you have some.
So that you have some margin. That was the essence of choosing a conservative oil price benchmark. The National Assembly, in every single year, raised that benchmark such that it made the possibility of saving more and more tenuous. The only reason we got away with it then was that oil prices were consistently higher than we projected because the market was rising. So between the National Assembly and, of course, the failure of the executive in enforcing its will, if he knew what it was making a right, I mean, there's a point at which, if you know you want to, the essence of leadership is insisting on the right thing being done. So we depleted the excess crude accounts, we shared it all. We didn't allow through the budget price benchmark for conservative benchmarks that could allow us to save. We depleted the foreign reserves. And then you are surprised that oil prices collapsed and that you don't have savings. Meanwhile, there's also a fundamental trend you see in this. It's apparent that the governors and the states have prioritized contractors' obligations over staff salaries. So for me, that's not rational. You cannot prioritize something you entered into voluntarily over an obligation that will be there forever. So you have ISPOs, irrevocable standing payment orders, that have been signed to meet contractors' obligations. There's a hint of improper motive even in that, because of course probably that confers some benefits while salaries do not confer any benefits. So you have all of those factors that have led to what we now have, this quagmire in which 18 states, and possibly if oil prices don't reverse, many more, because we know that in reality, in terms of structuring your government such that your internally generated resources can pay salaries and run government, there are very few states that are...
The same Osun State, for instance, I mean, I was just digging through, and in 2011, I think it was about a year in office at the time, he was addressing financial journalists, and he said, well, he had been able to increase the IGR from 300 million to 600 million, and that he had paid worker salaries, that he didn't have to wait for allocation before paying worker salaries. And exactly in his words, that any government that waits on the revenue, the allocation, before he pays salaries, will be in trouble. So it looked as though he had all of this figured out and he was on course.
I saw that statement as well. I don't want to personalize it as Osun, because this is a bigger issue.
Yeah, different states are responding differently.
But they all have, I think they all, to demonstrate that this is not some mystery, inexplicable thing. I remember in 2007, we were advising a particular state government. This was, 2007, 2008. This was before the global financial crisis. But there were already speculations. If you read oil market analysis, there were already issues about the oil price having peaked. It was already in July 2008. It had already risen to almost $147 per barrel. Any enlightened person knew that oil prices could only go down. In that year, we told that state government, whatever the federal government gives you, discounts by a significant percentage so that you can be placed for a shock. That state government listened at that time and was prepared when, by the last quarter of 2008, oil prices crashed. And therefore, its budget had sufficiently reflected that. That January in 2009, which was the first full year of the global crisis, again we advised them, okay, so this should be your, irrespective of what the federal budget is, make this assumption about oil prices. So the point I'm making is that this was not some mystery. It's a failure of economic management, it's a failure of maybe even values maybe even issues of corruption.
You know,
maybe there's even a link with the political campaigns.
I want to
because
take it
people
beyond.
have invested in politics rather
Let's
than
go into the politics of it. You, as a policy analyst, a lawyer, someone who is also looking at the economy, definitely you speak to some people. For the experts in such cabinets, definitely we know their credentials. Most of them, if not all, have intimidating credentials that can help that state drive the economy and better advise the government of the day. Don't you think that, how does it operate now? Don't they give advice in that regard that will see the state save up for bad times?
There's a uniformity about the political practice that has emerged in Nigeria. A governor is an emperor. The commissioners, they sit in council. In some cases, they don't even bother to sit in council. But I don't think the bottom line is that the governor is king. We even have managed to have some level of checks and balances on power at the federal level. The Senate, the House of Reps. But in the states, the legislative function and the cabinet as a restraint on executive authority is non-existent. And therefore, if the governor enters into obligations, the Commissioner for Finance just disburses to those obligations. I don't think many of the states, with the exception of a few, and I know those few, which I won't mention, but I don't think many of the states have allowed, even if the person is technically qualified, the structure of power and the structure of patronage in those states has allowed anybody to do technical advice and say, Mr.
So there's
Governor,
a hindrance.
Yes, there's a significant, that's a political reality, just like you said. So even if I've had statements like, see, you are a technocrat, let us do, we know what we are doing here. You know, when we are ready, we'll call you. Because the reality is that you've run, especially because we've had a transition, a very interesting transition in which a lot of resources were required, in which a lot of excitement was generated. So I don't think those kind of experts, except in a few cases, would have been allowed to do their work. So it's not a failure of knowledge. I think we often assume that technical skills are what is lacking, but often it's the motives that are wrong, it's the structures that are wrong, it's the political environment that is wrong.